did they break her body to save her soul. You are watching the final moments of Tudor England's greatest heresy, where personal conviction became high treason. And in 1546, the landscape of Tudor England was defined not by misty fields, but by the capricious shifts in the king's conscience, forcing you to exist under a permanent psychological siege where your personal conviction could be interpreted as high treason. The great seismic shift had occurred when Henry VIII shattered Rome's spiritual authority, yet the ground remained dangerously unstable, demanding a careful silence and strategic ambiguity that few possessed, least of all the young woman named Anne Askew. To grasp Scripture outside the approved confines of the Church was an act of spiritual rebellion, challenging temporal and divine law simultaneously. Why reading this book led to the rack is shocking, because Anne Askew, born in 1521, possessed a fierce, dangerous curiosity, consuming the newly accessible Bible and seeking her own truth in the text. And you must understand the profound danger of simply reading a book during this time. For this was not merely studying. It was the quiet, internal forging of an independent identity, something the age fundamentally feared. The surprising way marriage failed one of Henry VIII's victims. Anne's life took a tragic, inevitable turn when she was married to Thomas Kyme, an ardent traditionalist who viewed her independent reading with suspicion and later outright hostility, transforming their home into a crucible of the national conflict, a domestic echo of the schism that had divided the kingdom. As her Protestant convictions hardened, the marriage fractured beyond repair, and some accounts suggest that Kyme, unable to conform her spirit, physically cast her out of their shared life. Yet for Anne, this rejection was a liberation, propelling her toward the intellectual heart of the Reformation in London and directly into the view of the authorities. The reason her refusal to say 4 words sealed her fate is critical. London was a volatile mosaic of clandestine meetings and public denunciations, and Anne found herself among the reformers, sharing texts and exchanging ideas in hushed tones, her natural eloquence and fervent belief quickly making her a visible, undeniable figure. The intensity of her commitment was a double-edged sword, cementing her resolve but simultaneously magnifying her profile to the very men seeking to quell dissent. She was candid, she was resolute, and she spoke openly about the doctrines she rejected, particularly the Catholic belief of transubstantiation, a refusal that was not a minor theological quibble, but a denial of the core ritual power structure. Widekind changed everything. Consider the courage required to stand before the king's agents, knowing that your words, theology drawn from personal study, could lead you to the fire, as Anne Askew was arrested in 1545. The focus of this interrogation was less about her soul and more about the network she represented. And the authorities, led by the zealous Lord Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley and the notorious Richard Rich, did not just want a confession, they wanted names. The shocking secret Henry VIII's agents tortured her to reveal. The atmosphere of the interrogation rooms was thick with the manufactured weight of officialdom, dark paneling, sparse light filtering through narrow windows, emphasizing the isolation of the accused, and the questions were relentless, seeking to map the invisible lines of Protestant influence that reached into the highest echelons of court. Crucially, Queen Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's final wife, harbored reformist sympathies, and Wriothesley saw Anne as the vulnerable thread that could unravel the Queen's own protected status. Why silence was the ultimate weapon against the king. Anne was brought before the council multiple times. Yet despite the mounting pressure and the implicit threats hanging in the air, her composure remained unnerving. She would argue theology, defend her views with scripture, but she would not yield the names of her associates. The officials, accustomed to the swift breakdown of lesser suspects, grew increasingly frustrated by her unwavering silence. For her resistance was not simply spiritual defiance. It was an act of profound political obstruction, protecting a circle of influence that touched the king's household. The terrifying reason they chose the rack for a woman of noble lineage, you are standing in the shadows of that frustration, witnessing the machinery of state power grinding against one solitary will. And when polite interrogation failed, the methods invariably turned darker and heavier. The goal shifted from ideological correction to physical submission, aiming to break the vessel so the secrets might spill out.
and intimidation gave way to the threat of physical suffering, a tactic rarely employed against women, especially those of noble lineage. The severity of the coming ordeal speaks volumes about the perceived danger she posed. The agonizing choice that defined her last moments, the ultimate instrument of coercion, was brought forth: the rack, a symbol of absolute state power reserved for the most obstinate political and religious offenders. And Anne Askew became one of the very few women in English history condemned to face this severe suffering. The chroniclers relate the grim details: the stretching of the limbs, the agonizing pull against the joints, aiming for dislocation, and the light in the chamber would have seemed to dim, focusing only on the horrifying geometry of the device and the diminishing strength of the prisoner. They pushed the lever themselves. In the Tower of London, in a cold, stone chamber, the officials personally supervised the cruelty, pushing the lever as the sounds of stressed muscle and ligament filled the silence.
Wrisley and Rich, desperate for the names that would implicate the Queen's circle, reportedly turned the handles themselves. Yet, even as her body neared collapse and dislocation, Anne remained silent concerning her friends. She endured the unimaginable pain, her fortitude turning the rack, designed to extract truth, into a grotesque monument to her resilience. How one woman's agony exposed the limits of royal power. Imagine the clarity born of such acute pain, where every nerve ending is screaming, yet the mind holds firm to the single defining principle. To betray her associates would have saved her body, but it would have killed the very faith for which she was suffering. Her refusal to yield was a final, profound declaration that the state could control her life, but not her conscience. And this unbreakable spirit transformed her from a condemned dissenter into a symbolic hero of the nascent Reformation movement. She couldn't walk to the fire. Her body broken, her spirit intact, the authorities had exhausted their means of extraction. The charge was heresy. The sentence was predetermined: death by burning. The ritual of the execution was swift in its finality, yet purposefully drawn out in its public spectacle, as the goal was to cleanse the theological stain and provide a terrifying deterrent to any others considering dissent. Anne was so severely injured from the rack that she could not walk, having to be carried to the site of her final ordeal. Flipping moment, the executioner offered a final pardon. On July 16, 1546, the scene was set in Smithfield, which was not just an execution, but a theater of state-sanctioned violence, with crowds gathered in a mix of morbid curiosity and fearful reverence. Anne was bound to the stake, the wood piled high, the air heavy with the scent of pitch. And to offer her a final chance to recant, a pardon was reportedly held out, a stark choice between life and the fidelity of her convictions. The 4 words she spoke just before the fire, her famous reply, sealed her fate. She chose the fire over the betrayal of her faith, and as the torch was applied and the flames began their ascent, Anne Askew displayed no fear. Her composure at the stake was remarked upon by onlookers, lending a martyr's dignity to the tragic end. She met her demise, a cruel death, condemned by the very structures of power she dared to question. But in that fire, her physical presence was erased, and her symbolic power was forged. The flames consumed her, yet this was not the end of Anne Askew's story. How her death started a revolution. News of her severe suffering and defiant execution spread like wildfire through England and across the continent, and her tragedy became a critical rallying point, galvanizing the Protestant minority and exposing the brutal extremes of the king's religious enforcement. The image of the courageous woman broken on the rack, yet steadfast at the stake, was a powerful indictment of authority. You are now left to measure the cost of that conviction against the power of the legacy. The act of state violence against a vulnerable subject often achieves the opposite of its intent. And instead of suppressing dissent, the state created a martyr, providing the burgeoning Reformation with a powerful, relatable symbol of resilience. Her memory was quickly enshrined, most notably in John Fox's seminal work, The Book of Martyrs, ensuring that her trial and execution would endure through the centuries. The secret reason historians call her a pioneer of intellectual liberty. Historians today view Anne Askew not just as a religious casualty, but as an early figure in the struggle for individual intellectual liberty.
for she was a woman who dared to occupy public theological space, a realm explicitly forbidden to her gender, and her defiance fundamentally challenged the social and religious constraints of her time. Her actions were far ahead of the curve,
illustrating how personal belief can become a catalyst for profound systemic challenge. The true impact of her life and death was the resonating challenge it presented to the fragility of Tudor power. And every time a Protestant read a forbidden text, every time a reformer spoke in defiance, Anne Askew's shadow was present. Her fortitude became a hallmark of the Reformation era, a testament to devotion that stood against overwhelming force. Centuries later, the quiet historians who sift through the archives of this grim period continue to find the resonance of her final moments, reading the dry court records and official condemnations, but hearing the underlying echo of pain and bravery. Anne Askew's short life stands as a stark reminder. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon against absolute power is not an army, but a person's refusal to be silenced. This video is created for educational and historical purposes. It examines themes of power, corruption, and human conflict without depicting explicit or graphic events. Anne Askew's story of bravery, resilience, and sacrifice remains a chilling case study in the dynamics of historical persecution. It forces one to confront the ultimate moral question: what conviction is worth the absolute suffering and the final, tragic end? If this story made you reflect on the fragility of power, stay with us for the next chapter as we continue to walk further into history's shadows.